Today I'm joined by Dr. John Cook. John is a cognitive scientist who focuses on misinformation and science denial. In 2007, he founded Skeptical Science, a website that would go on to win the 2011 Eureka Prize for the advancement of climate change knowledge and the 2016 Friend of the Planet Award from the National Center for Science Education. He co-authored the Debunking Handbook, the Conspiracy Theory Handbook, as well as the COVID-19 Vaccine Communication Handbook. And he also developed the massive open online course, Denial 101X, Making Sense of Climate Science Denial. Thanks for joining us today on AVAXX 101, John.
Thanks, Tom.
So to start, John, I just wanted to ask you about misinformation. And in particular, I was wondering if you could comment on why misinformation is so sticky.
Misinformation is sticky for a bunch of reasons, unfortunately. Firstly, I think misinformation isn't bound by facts or the truth. So it can be as exciting or shocking or ludicrous or attention-grabbing as it likes, because it doesn't have to be accurate. And so that's why misinformation headlines are more viral than accurate headlines. People are more likely to view them, click on them, share them, and it's just a quantifiable fact that misinformation spreads more virally on social networks. And then once it gets into people's heads, it's really hard to dislodge it. Once people believe misconceptions, it's really difficult to correct the misconception and stop people relying on that misinformation. Psychologists call it the continued influence effect. The fact that even if people hear a correction and agree with it, understand it, they can still be influenced by the misinformation and continue to believe it, or at least believe aspects of it without even necessarily realizing it.
So what are some of the ways that people can spot the difference between facts and misinformation?
The way that I think about it is I divide the different ways of responding to misinformation in 3 different ways: fact-based, logic-based, and source-based. So one way that we can spot misinformation is by having a better understanding of the facts. If you understand how the world works, if you understand the mechanisms of vaccination or the mechanisms of climate change, then you're better able to spot misinformation that distorts the facts. From a logic point of view, if you understand the rhetorical techniques or the logical fallacies in misinformation, then you're more likely to be able to spot attempts to mislead you. And thirdly, source-based, if you are aware of discredited sources or bad faith actors, people who are more likely to promote disinformation, then you can treat information coming from those sources with more suspicion and be more resilient to being misled.
Can you tell us about the process that you have described as inoculation or pre-bunking and explain how it works?
Yeah, so inoculation theory is a branch of psychological research which we say we borrow the idea of vaccination. You might say plagiarizes the idea of vaccination. But it basically takes the idea of vaccination and applies it to knowledge. So research going back to the 1950s found that if you expose people to a weakened form of misinformation that builds up their immunity, I guess you could call it cognitive antibodies, so that they're less likely to be influenced or misled by when they encounter the actual misinformation.
And why is pre-bunking so important?
As I was saying before, we have this continued influence effect, where once that misinformation gets in there, it's really hard to dislodge it. It's like a weed. Even if you pull it out, it comes back again. And so if you can stop the damage from happening in the first place, it's like the saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Is that the saying? But often, not always, but often it can be more efficient to pre-bunk and stop the damage from happening than trying to undo the damage afterwards.
And what are the main misleading techniques of science denial that you've uncovered?
So there's a whole landscape of different misleading techniques, but the way I try to make sense of it is using a framework which I call the Flick framework, which was actually developed originally by Mark Hufnagel. And what he documented was these 5 categories of misleading techniques in science denial: fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. So that's FLICC, Flick. And that's really just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Underneath that, you have a whole range of different logical fallacies and rhetorical techniques and traits of conspiratorial thinking. But that's kind of the overall landscape, and it's a very useful framework for identifying different techniques and just making sense of all the different fallacies that you might encounter.
Now, you've said debunk often and do it properly. In what ways can people debunk misinformation more effectively?
The general structure that I recommend people use is, when they're debunking misinformation or doing fact checking, or just generally either inoculating, pre-bunking, or debunking, is the fact, myth, fallacy structure. Although lately, when we just published the Debunking Handbook 2020, we've kind of amended it slightly. Now it's fact, myth, fallacy, fact structure. And the idea of it is, the most important element of a debunking is dislodging the myth with a replacement fact. If you're debunking a myth, for example, people are saying, well, this thing is causing that thing. The sun is causing global warming, or vaccination is causing autism. It's whatever causal myth. The most effective way to debunk it is to replace that wrong causal explanation with the correct causal explanation. I know that it's really difficult. One of the big challenges with debunking the vaccine autism link is what causes autism is complex, and it's not the single one cause. So it's a lot easier for me working in climate misinformation perhaps than you working in vaccination misinformation. But the general principle with debunking is fight sticky myths with stickier facts. So find that factual replacement and dislodge the myth. And so a effective debunking needs to put the emphasis on that fact, that core fact that you're trying to communicate, and try to communicate it in as sticky way as possible. If possible, make it even stickier than the myth that you're trying to debunk. The second element of a debunking is, you do need to mention the myth. There has been some talk about backfire effects and worry that you might make people more familiar with the myth, and the more familiar we are with information, the more likely we are to think that it's true. So it could potentially backfire. This was something we wrote about in the first debunking handbook back in 2011. Since then, over the last 10 years, researchers have struggled to replicate the backfire effect. It's very rare that it actually happens. It does happen in some contexts, but most of the time, not really. And so what we concluded in the updated debunking handbook in 2020 was, don't let the fear of backfire effects dissuade you from engaging with and debunking misinformation. The far greater danger is to leave misinformation unchallenged. And so we do recommend that you mention a myth when you debunk it, because you want to activate it in people's minds in order for them to tag it as false. And then if you kind of just try to tiptoe around it, it kind of leaves it in people's mental models without being tagged as false. The third element of an effective debunking is the fallacy, or explaining the either rhetorical techniques or the logical fallacies in the misinformation. And the reason you want to explain this is because if you just explain the fact and the myth, It's like two conflicting pieces of information. Explaining the fallacy helps people resolve that conflict between the two. So they can understand how these two conflicting pieces of information can coexist at the same time, because here's the fact, that's the true state of the world, and here is the myth which commits a certain fallacy to distort the facts. And then it's always good to end with the fact again, reinforce that sticky fact that you want to leave with people, kind of wrapping everything in a kind of a factual wrapper, in a sense, a fact sandwich.
A fact sandwich. So you mentioned making facts stickier than the myth, but how can we make a fact stickier? Like, how do we go about doing that?
Yeah, that's really, it's a non-trivial thing to do. And even now, having gone through this process, each time we do it, it's a struggle, because there's no one way to do it. It's not a paint by numbers thing. It's kind of part art, part science. It's communication is a creative process. But what I find really useful is a framework from a book, Made to Stick, by the Heath brothers, by Dan and Chip Heath. And what they do is they look at all these different sticky examples of sticky messages, whether they were advertising campaigns or folk stories or urban legends or just effective messages. And they find that they all share some of the following 6 characteristics. And again, an acronym helps me to remember it. The acronym is SUCCESS: simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional, and story. So most important is to make your facts as simple as possible, not oversimplify, but boil down your fact to the key core truth, or what's that core idea that you're trying to communicate in your fact. When you take people by surprise, they're more likely to remember information and more likely to share it. So often science is counterintuitive, and we kind of shirk from that, but that's something I think to lean into as science communicators. Take those extraordinary statistics and lean into them and take people by surprise. Give them unexpected science information to make it stickier. Often our science is abstract. It can be statistical. It can be these, really difficult concepts to explain, whether it's at the microscopic or the, at the macroscopic level. And making that concrete can be challenging. I find that analogies or metaphors are a really powerful way to take concepts that people aren't familiar with and borrow existing concepts in people's minds and use those analogies as a way to explain concepts and make them more concrete. And that's not only useful for explaining science, I also use it a lot for explaining logic. I lean a lot on using analogies to explain logical fallacies by taking a fallacy and some misinformation and applying it to real world examples. And I'll give you a quick example of that. One common fallacy in vaccination misinformation is using examples. Well, the fallacy is mistaking correlation for causation. Two things happen close to each other, and they assume that one must have caused the other. And so we ran an experiment where the analogy we used was a sports fan who wore their team's colours at a game, and their team won, and they assume, I was wearing the team colours and we won, therefore I have to wear these team colours every time we play and we'll continue to win. He was mistaking the correlation of him wearing the team colours for causation, thinking that caused the team to win. It's exactly the same fallacy as the same logic of thinking, well, this person got vaccinated and then suffered this side effect, sometime afterwards, so one must have caused the other. Where am I up to? Concrete. I'll just jump to probably the last one, which is story. We remember information in the form of stories. So if you can communicate your science in a way that tells a story, that in narrative form, people are more likely to pay attention to it, remember it, and share it.
And I suppose inoculation in relation to pre-bunking is another example of using analogy to explain something.
As in using the
borrowing.
metaphor of inoculation, but applied to communication.
You're borrowing from vaccines and how vaccinations work to it.
Yeah, definitely. It's like I find when I talk about how to counter misinformation, and when I use that inoculation analogy, you just see the light turn on in people's eyes when they suddenly get, right, it's about exposing them to a weakened form of the misinformation. Like you're delivering, you're explaining the way that the misinformation misleads, and that's basically delivering it in weakened form.
Yeah, it's a very sticky way of explaining that the pre-bunking. So it was sticky for me. So I found that was a very effective way of explaining it, and then allowing me to explain it to others. Now, in terms of my own research on anti-vaccination media, I found that conspiracy theory narratives are often a significant component of counter-vaccine claims and online posts. And I was wondering if you have any really concrete tips on how to reach people who have accepted conspiracy theories or who are interested in kind of conspiracy ideas, both around vaccines, but also more generally.
Yeah, the first qualifier I would give to that question is it's already hard to dislodge misinformation in the best of conditions. When you have someone who's starting to go down that rabbit hole of conspiratorial thinking, it's almost impossible in those conditions, because they treat any information that contradicts their conspiracy theory with suspicion. One of the key traits of conspiratorial thinking is immunity to evidence. And if you prove that their conspiracy theory is wrong, they'll actually consider that evidence to be part of the conspiracy. Obviously, the conspirators created that information to try to fool us. So it's really hard to change people's minds under those conditions. So again, pre-bunking or trying to stop people believing in conspiracy theories in the first place is the more effective strategy. And that takes you back to inoculation. But to answer your question, if you have a family member or a friend or someone and you want to try to talk them out of their conspiracy theories, we actually have a section on this in the Conspiracy Theory Handbook, and we talk about a couple of strategies that have been explored in research. Obviously, the first thing is don't ridicule people. That's instantly going to put their walls up, and you're not going to make any headway at all. Secondly, the opposite of that is using empathy and trying to, rather than ridicule, try to understand their position, and just taking an empathetic approach to how you talk to them. And thirdly, I think that appealing to common values can be a fruitful approach, and in particular, the common value of critical thinking. Conspiracy theorists like to think of themselves as critical thinkers. They're not gullible. They haven't been taken in by the official government account like all the sheep will have. So they use the language of critical thinking themselves. So appeal to that common value and encourage them to apply their critical thinking to their own theory, thinking through their arguments, their evidence. Is it a consistent theory? And where there are inconsistencies or where the evidence conflicts, encourage them to apply critical thinking to that. That said, it's a really difficult ask because of that immunity to evidence.
It's interesting, that comment about critical thinking, because that's something that I found across counter-science media, is the claim that, look, we are actually people who are skeptical and thinking critically about all of the data and information, rather than the sheep who are just accepting what the academics and government are telling them. That's a very interesting point. Now, on a more personal note, while your initiatives have been award-winning, you also seem to receive quite a bit of abuse online. There's some pictures of you online that have been edited and some attacks on you. And I was just wondering how you respond and deal with negative attacks for your work on combating science denial. And one of the reasons why I ask is I have a number of friends and coworkers who have actually been interested in promoting pro-science views online, and they've actually said that they've been afraid to do so because of fear of receiving such negative attacks. So I'm interested in how you deal with it and respond to it.
Before I answer that question, it's really interesting that you mentioned friends' fear of negative pushback. I just want to comment on that first, and then I'll directly answer your question, because one thing that's really concerned me, and this is just really more within the climate issue, but I think it applies more broadly to other scientific issues, is the problem of climate silence. The fact that even though most of the population are concerned or alarmed about climate change, most of them don't talk about climate change with their friends and family. And there's some really interesting research by Janet Swim and Nathaniel Geiger exploring why. Why do people self-censor about climate change? And they found that the biggest predictor was a misconception called pluralistic ignorance. People are ignorant of the fact that they're in the majority. They don't realize that science deniers are a tiny fraction of the population because they're a very vocal minority. So they're bigger than we think they are. In Australia, I can't remember the latest data, but a number of years back, when you ask the general public how many people deny climate change is real, they'll say the average answer is around 21%, when the actual answer is 7%. So we think that they're 3 times larger group than they actually are because they're such a vocal minority. And so people self-censor because they're worried about pushback. So I think that the first thing to do is break this misconception of pluralistic ignorance by just communicating just basic, I guess, survey data of the general population. Most people are on board with the science, and science deniers and conspiracy theorists tend to be a very small fraction. They might get all the media attention. We see QAnon, we see the anti-vaxxer rallies on TV, because that's a much more exciting video than a person at home quietly agreeing with scientists, right? So it's kind of a sort of a flaw with media coverage. So yeah, debunking, I think, the misconception of pluralistic ignorance is a first step. And inoculation is also the second step, because inoculation not only makes people resilient from being misled, there's also research into a thing called post-inoculation talk, which is the fact that when people are inoculated against denialist arguments, they're more likely to talk about the issue because they're more confident, they feel empowered, so that if they did receive pushback, they would know how to respond to it. They know what the fallacies are, they know what the counter arguments are, and they're just more confident. So inoculation is another way of empowering people to feel more confident and engage and defend science online or in conversations. As for the question on how do I personally handle all the attacks that I get, and this has been going for like a decade now, it does take its toll, but I think I'm in the unique position that I research misinformation, I research attacks on science, and so I guess maybe you might call a psychologist or a psychiatrist might say this is a coping mechanism, but the way that I view even personal attacks is it's like data. It's the kind of thing that I study. So it's almost like sometimes when I'm getting personally attacked, I feel almost a bit like that, the original Tron movie, where Jeff Bridges gets pulled into the computer and he's playing the game that he created. Like sometimes I feel like the thing that I'm studying is attacking me, you know. So I guess from your point of view, it might be like a vaccination researcher getting infected with the disease he's studying, perhaps. But that kind of gives me a bit of, I guess, distance from it, not seeing the people who attack me as necessarily enemies, but more seeing them as part of the larger movement of climate denial. And attacks on me is just another example of attempts to delegitimize science in general.
So they're just giving you more data to work with, is what you're saying.
Yeah, like science deniers respond to stimuli in very predictable ways. So, like so a stimuli might be me communicating the 97% consensus, and they respond in very predictable ways because science denial is a gut instinct reaction. And I've even used that to help inoculate people against misinformation. Once I wrote a conversation article where it was about the techniques of science denial using climate change as an example. And then I finished the conversation article saying, and now you're going to see all these 5 techniques, the FLIC techniques, fake experts, logical fallacies, etc. Now you're going to see them in the comments thread. And it happened exactly like what I predicted. And they started responding with climate denial arguments using all of those fallacies. And the same thing happens when I give public talks. Once I gave a talk about the techniques of denial, and then during the Q&A, some climate deniers started asking me questions and throwing misinformation at me. And then after the talk was finished, someone came up to me and said, "Did you plant those climate deniers in the audience as a way of illustrating the techniques of denial?" Unfortunately, I didn't. I would never be that organized or sneaky.
Because that would require too much of a conspiracy. And just to clarify, when you're referring to the 97% consensus, that's on your work demonstrating the consensus of researchers who agree that there is anthropogenic climate change happening.
Yes, the attacks on me personally really began in earnest in 2013 while I was at the University of Queensland, when I, working with some other scientists, published a paper finding that 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. Actually, no, 97% of climate papers stating a position on human-caused global warming agreed that human-caused global warming was happening. And that, because that research got a lot of attention, that's, you know, with great impact comes equal and opposite pushback. That's when the personal attacks started. And the irony was, ours wasn't the first paper to find 97% consensus. We were in 2013, but in 2009, Peter Doran found 97% consensus. In 2010, William Anderegg also published a separate paper finding 97% consensus. So just like my inoculation theory is plagiarizing your vaccination work, our 97% consensus work was derivative as well. But it just happened to get more attention, and then that's where the attacks came from. Also, I once interviewed Peter Doran actually for our University of Queensland MOOC, and he told me that whenever people sent him criticisms of his 97% paper, he just said, "Well, there's a new one out by Cook, so why don't you just go and talk to him instead."
Oh, that's very interesting. It's also very interesting what you said about about people just not realizing that they're actually in the majority. And in many ways, that's even more so with vaccine resistance, because often in most countries, only 1% to 3% of the entire population would be constituted as ardent vaccine deniers. And yet that voice seems significantly louder than 1% to 3% of the population.
Yeah, I mean that's even 1% to 3% for vaccination. With climate change, it's like around 10%. What we call dismissives, at least in the US. It's a little lower in Australia, but yeah, like so they get so much attention, and there's a lot of concern about it. So yeah, it's interesting, and I think helping people understand that this minority, as vocal as they are a very tiny minority. That's an important message.
It is. I think that's a very important message. And I think that your interview here today has been very helpful for the students. And I think you've provided a lot of great information. So thank you for joining us on AVAXX 101 today.
Thanks, Tom. I look forward to doing the course myself.
That would be great. Thanks, John.
Yeah, my pleasure.